I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. My name is Jane Woodward, and I have a real privilege at this moment, which is I get to celebrate 3 of my friends at once, and each of them have the same 3 things in common. So those 3 people are Conradin von Gugelberg, and this, let's see if I can click the slide. Conradin von Gugelberg, Amory Lovins, and J.B. Straubel, all men that I think of as my friends. So the 3 things that they have in common that I'd at least like to call out, because they probably had even more things in common, is the fact that they all think, as Amory would say, as integrative designers or design thinkers. They like to look at things as a system. All 3 men obsessed with resource efficiency, and I would say all 3 men are very productive, or were productive disruptors. I mean, so we got to change things around here, right? But there's ways to do it that are more productive than others. So that's the context for why I have the privilege of standing in front of you, is because of my relationship with all 3 men. This slide is devoted to contextualizing this talk today, and to talk just a minute about Conradin von Gugelberg. So Conradin was in my business school class of 1987, and there's some remarkable people in the front row who, with me, when we lost Conradin about a year after we graduated, we decided it was really important to honor Conradin's spirit. He was a kind, gentle, extraordinary man who looked at the world on that framework that I talked about. He thought about the whole system. He really cared about resource efficiency. And believe it or not, in 1985, when we were in business school, there was no way to recycle anything, and it drove him nuts. And he very quietly and productively disrupted that problem and worked to solve it. So when we lost Conradin, we wanted to create an annual lecture to honor his memory, because he was an extraordinary person. And today, as I stand before you, there have been over 30 Conradin von Gugelberg memorial lectures, all on leadership in the environment. And this today is the latest and greatest. This is an example of some of the remarkable people, and we're adding J.B. Straubel to that list today. But the person at the bottom of this list is J.B.'s and my very good friend, Amory Lovins. And if you haven't met Amory, you're going to in just a moment, because he's going to introduce J.B. And he is an extraordinary integrative designer. And if those of you who've never thought of that as an identity, hopefully by the time I'm done talking, Amory's done talking, J.B. is done talking, you're going to change your point of view and want to be one as well. So just quickly, because Amory has given the Conradin von Gugelberg lecture twice over the last 35 years himself, I want to make sure you all know who he is. He's one of my superheroes, and he has a very accomplished resume. But the most important things today are the fact that he co-founded the Rocky Mountain Institute, today known as RMI, that he teaches today, which we're going to talk about in a moment, extreme energy efficiency here at Stanford, winter and spring quarters with his colleague Joel Swisher, and he has a remarkable spouse, Judy, who I adore. To back up a little bit, I'm going to give you a little bit of time travel. In 1980, I arrived at Stanford to pursue a 2-year master's degree in geology. But my very first quarter, I took a class that I have since been teaching the last 33 years. Today, we call it Understand Energy. It had a different name at the time. And one of the 2 required textbooks was Amory's book, Soft Energy Paths, which ultimately embraced this idea of resource efficiency and the idea we, believe it or not, would get smarter over time, and we would not keep doing things the way we'd done them in the past. So this book changed my life. I reached out to Amory Lovins. Back then, the only way to do it was from a payphone, and we have been friends ever since, and it's been important to me to support Amory's work. So in 1996, Amory introduced and published widely on the topic of a hypercar. And this coincides broadly with, while this is going on, and I'm in touch with Amory, and he's coming and giving speeches about hypercars that I'm trying to help support, in roughly the same period of time, J.B. Straubel is a freshman sitting in the front row of my class in 1984. And I always like the people in the front row, so I like all of you already. And I always want to talk to them on the first day of class and say, well, who are you and what are you up to? And JB told me that he had already retrofitted a golf cart, he had already reassembled and disassembled a wind farm. I said, you're my kind of guy. But back in the same period where Amory's talking about a hypercar, JB's already thinking about how to reinvent transportation. So it's really cool that Amory and JB got to know each other during this period of time and have become very good friends. Now, if some of you are scratching your head and saying, what's a hypercar? The concept around hypercar, at least what I took away from it, is I didn't really realize at the time that for every gallon of gasoline that you put into an internal combustion engine car, 1% of the energy content moves you, 13% moves the weight of the car, and all the rest is lost. That really drove me nuts. So I'm really grateful to Amory and to JB for helping us reinvent transportation. So I put this in here to provide a little giggle, and we're going to contextualize bananas here in a moment. But this is a fun picture. It's in my conference room, in my office, off California Avenue in Palo Alto in 2008. So for those of you that are a lot younger than I am, what was going on in 2008? Well, Solar City was formed in 2006, which was later merged into Tesla. And Tesla was only about 5 years old, 6 years old, something like that. And so there's me, there's Amory, there's JB, there's our dear friend Gil Masters, who we're going to see tonight, who's taught more students about energy at Stanford and Stanford's history than anybody. And there's Lyndon Reeve, who ran Solar City, or co-ran Solar City. So just a fun picture in time. And the bananas are going to get more context in a moment. So there you go. So not only, remember I talked about these three men who I adore, they have in common resource efficiency, system thinking, and productive change. So Amory walks the talk. He has one of the most extraordinary homes in Old Snowmass, Colorado, and out of it he has grown, he's on his 80th banana crop. So, you know, the instinct to grab a banana when you're around Amory, you're now in on the inside joke. So, quick advertisement for Amory's class, which he teaches with his fabulous colleague Joel Swisher. If you are inspired by what you hear today, I really urge you to take extreme energy efficiency, which is taught winter and spring quarter. It's open to people from all disciplines by intention. And in this class, it celebrates what JB and Amory have been propagating as pioneers, and Conradin did too, which is let's bring a beginner's mind to the problems we face. Let's not accept the status quo. Let's look at it anew and afresh. And as a very famous president once said, when faced with a gigantic array of problems, when you're looking for a solution, don't narrow in too tight. Actually make the problem bigger. Look at the whole system, which so many people, I feel like for a long time, I kept saying, Tesla's not a car company, it's an energy company. It's all about a system. And people looked at me like I was from Mars. But we need, as Amory would say, if you make a problem bigger, you can get factor 10 benefits because there's so many compounding opportunities in that process. So I'm almost done. So this photo means a great deal to me. All three of the people in this photo are sitting here in the front row, JB and Amory, who've been jamming on resource efficiency together now for decades, and their wonderful collaborator, Holmes Hummel, who is leading energy justice, I get it mixed up. Yes, energy justice program here at Stanford, Just Transitions. Energy equity and just transitions program here at Stanford, and I encourage you to look up Holmes if you have not already. So this is when we first kicked off this extreme energy efficiency class, which now is at Stanford rather than at RMI. And to close, and with a drum roll, Amory, as you start to walk up here, I would like to, we talked, the leaders of this conference talked about optimism. And Amory is a beacon of applied hope. And I encourage you to go to the RMI website, and at this page that I'm showing here, you can download a fabulous speech that Amory gave, the language of which I share regularly with my students and friends. But I decided to share an excerpt for you to just read for a moment. And I would say this is the playbook that JB has been operating from, that Amory has been operating from, and that Conradin operated from for as long as he was able. Thank you so much for being here, and I get to hand you off to my friend Amory Levins.
It's been my honor for a long time to know JB as an extraordinary engineer and human being. And I want to tell you a couple of little things that he might not get around to in his remarks, just to give you an idea of what a master of design he is. There was a Tesla Roadster, early model, long time ago. You might get to see it in a minute, based on a Lotus Elise platform, a nice light one. It had a little problem, though. It had a gearbox which kept blowing up because it couldn't do the top speed and the top acceleration. And a couple of good gearbox firms broke their pick on it. And this was kind of a nagging problem. We started to think about, gee, maybe the right answer is no gears. So one day, I mean, if I get this story wrong, I'm sure JB can correct me, but I understand that one day he came into the office and said to his team, hey, let's insource this problem to our core capabilities and competences. We are electrical engineers, and if we can wring an extra 1/3 torque out of our motor, then we won't need the gearbox. And they said, well, that doesn't sound right because something's going to overheat and you'll have to Band-Aid on this elaborate cooling system. And then he said, oh, don't worry, if something gets hot, we'll figure out what it is and we'll give it a bigger cross-section or a better conductivity. So they did. And the gears went away with big gains in saved weight, extended range, greatly reduced cost and complexity. And this was a great lesson in designing stuff out that shouldn't be there. Because, as Saint-Exupéry said, perfect simplicity is achieved not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And that became a durable source of Tesla's competitive advantage built deeply into its culture. Many, many examples of that radical simplification. One other story comes to mind as well. Let's see if I could remember what it is. Oh, yes. One of JB's very first decisions when they were going to put up the Gigafactory to make lots of batteries in Nevada was that there will be no gas pipe. It would have to be all electric. It would run off solar cells on the roof. And his colleague said, JB, you must be nuts. We're going to need a lot of process heat to run this factory. And everybody knows you do that with gas because it's cheaper. He said, just watch. So it goes off to the office where Nevada issues air pollution permits. And in a half hour, he gets the permit because he's not burning anything. So that's easy. Comes back with the permit. Gee, normally that takes 6 months if it's uncontested. I wonder what 6 months is worth in the battery business. And then he starts to look at the process heat, and the biggest process heat load is continuously redistilling a solvent that they need to make the battery. Normally this would be done with a thermal megawatt of gas boilers. He ends up doing it with a single electric heat pump that would fit under your dining room table, and it takes 15 kilowatts, so that's, what, 98.5% or something less energy. Why? Because it turns out that the temperature rise you need, the difference between boiling and distilling the solvent, is only 1.5 Celsius degrees. It's not 1,000-odd degree flame temperature. You'd think this would be obvious, but somehow it hadn't been noticed before. One of the more elegant examples of beginner's mind, throwing away your assumptions and preconceptions and just taking a fresh look at what's really needed. And I understand he then went through other process heat loads, and it was kind of a similar story. So I just offer that by way of introduction to a person I think is one of the greatest living engineers and doing extraordinary things for all of us, J.B. Straubel.
I'll try and share a couple of perspectives, maybe a little bit of a story or a few stories of my career and my life and some of the things I've done, and try and weave that into what I think are the important topics and lessons of what we did at Tesla and why that's still so important, and today what I'm doing at Redwood Materials. But I think even to take a step back, for me, I think it's extremely important to really understand what you're aiming at, and to make sure when you're, especially if you're an entrepreneur and you start getting sucked in the direction of a company or a problem, to make sure that you're aligned with something that really matters. And I saw a quote or two, I think, in the beginning that echoed with that. But it's extremely important, and it's all too easy, I think, to be an entrepreneur, and pretty soon you're caught up in the current, and you're going in a direction, and you don't have the luxury of really looking and zooming way out. So to me, the imperative to electrify really our whole world, to transition us off fossil fuels, is one of the sort of guiding true north principles that's excited me, that's kept me focused, and something I just care deeply about, even since before, when I was a student and before. And I know all of us have seen these graphs, but I think I'll take the opportunity to highlight it one more time, because I think this is so incredibly important. So channeling maybe Al Gore here a tiny bit, but this is literally just data. This is an interpretation. It's not a model. There's really no interpretation to speak of. It's just measured data of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And to me, this is really fundamentally the hardest problem facing collectively humanity. This is going to be something we're dealing with, transitioning, struggling, investing toward for decades. It touches almost every aspect of what we do in such profound ways. I'm immersed in it. I think about it almost every day, and it still shocks me. Sometimes when driving to work on like a really cold morning, on a cold morning when you can see condensation from everything burning natural gas. And if anybody lives in cold climates, you'll maybe have this experience. But you realize that literally every building, every home, every structure, has an exhaust pipe, maybe 2 or 3 or 4, every vehicle. So we're in this world where we're surrounded by things burning, by emissions. It's really quite pervasive. And it's an incredible opportunity, but also a little overwhelming sometimes. And perhaps even more maybe frustrating, if we look at that CO2 concentration graph, you'd think, okay, we have some awareness of this problem. We're really rallying all of this work towards sustainability, conferences like this, startup companies everywhere. You'd think it was getting better. Literally, we set a world record for CO2 emissions last year. So if we had the analogy of like we're in a hole, we're in this hole digging deeper, the hole is sort of how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. We're not stopping digging, we're actually digging at the fastest rate we've ever dug, deeper into the hole. So sitting at the bottom of the hole, digging deeper at the fastest rate ever, and actually accelerating how fast we're digging. So it's sort of like, if you're thinking in terms of math here, it's like the first and maybe even second derivative are all wrong on the same problem. And of course, the little dip there is 2020 with COVID. Even as much as that disrupted everything that we do, which was quite dramatic, it was still a really, really small fraction in terms of how much we actually have to change, and really quite quickly. So one maybe funny anecdote here. What does everyone think of when you think of the word 420 in this context? This is kind of a financial, business-oriented group, I think. Some of you probably might have some connotations that people remember. Well, it's probably not the one you think of, that was what I would highlight, but just last month, we passed 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we briefly passed it last year, but we passed it on the way up into the summer season in Northern Hemisphere this last month, and I doubt we'll ever go below it, probably in any of our lifetimes. So it's kind of a sobering thought to think about, but it's almost certain to not change. We'll probably plateau this, we can work really hard, and we can level this off, but it's going to take quite a long time to come back down. So, a different interpretation of 420, but one that I think is pretty important and fundamental. And before I sort of leave the topic of big picture stuff, I want to just show this picture, because I like this one. You see a lot of pictures of planet Earth, and we're all focused on thinking about the globe and how small it all is, but seldom do you really see one that's accurately representing the atmosphere. And this is a real picture, showing the thickness of the atmosphere, which is almost ephemeral. When you see it from space, there's just almost nothing there. It's a few miles thick. And the fact is we live in 2 dimensions, so you never really perceive how actual thin it is. If you could get in your car and drive 60 miles an hour straight up, we'd literally drive out of the atmosphere in a matter of like maybe 5 to 10 minutes. You couldn't breathe anymore. It's incredibly thin, even in the speeds and distances that we're used to navigating. But again, we don't always perceive that, so it kind of feels infinite in our current lives. But my point is, we can and we very much are affecting this. It's not a big thing that we're all kind of swimming around in and breathing. So it's something that I think, again, when you really wallow in that and think about it and realize that we're all sharing this, relatively small volume that we have to coexist in, it just seems crazy that we're putting so much change in chemistry into it. So I want to change gears a little bit here and go way back in time. And I'll sort of reverse back to the beginning of my journey on electrification and thinking about electric cars and batteries. I realize I've spent probably a major portion of my professional career working on batteries and EVs of one sort or other, but it did not start very glamorously. People think EVs were always these sort of fast sports cars and the sort of scene of lots of interesting rallies and stuff like that, but it was actually much more of a kind of hobbyist club. When I was a student, I was off converting these old bicycles and these weird, funny golf carts. This was actually at Stanford, this golf cart. I think it was a Sure Escort golf cart that I found and converted somewhere into a different electric vehicle. But it kind of felt like maybe the early days of the homebrew computer clubs. This was a topic of super nerds. There were enthusiasts who were kind of hacking and building these things in their garages, and we'd all take them to tiny little meets and show them off to each other, probably the only 10 people that actually cared back then. But this was kind of the fertile ground for how we were doing some innovation and starting to think about this stuff. And it was actually then migrating into Stanford, where some of the more interesting ideas and a little bit higher tech ideas started to happen. And there's a whole thing called solar car racing, which was very formative in my early days, still going on, where different university teams build cars, these very streamlined, ultra-efficient, kind of hypercar type vehicles that run entirely off solar from the sun on board the vehicle. And Stanford had a team, it was a good team. And when that was all going on when I was a student, it was kind of in the transition where batteries in those solar cars were just migrating from lead acid to nickel metal hydride and then to lithium-ion. It was in the early 2000s. So it was a very fascinating time to think about that. And it was as a sort of outgrowth of that myself and a handful of other students back then, I sort of rallied and created this electric vehicle team here at Stanford, started thinking about how could we string together literally thousands of laptop batteries and figure out how to make them actually power a car. You could actually take one of these little teeny laptop batteries. They'd just been invented then. They were maybe only a couple years old, and they had a sort of reputation and a reality, a penchant for catching fire if you didn't treat them just right. But the energy density was phenomenal, and it was better than anything that had come before. So we could measure one of those little batteries on a benchtop. We could make a model. We could tell that if you put enough of these together, you could have a vehicle that would suddenly be competitive. It would change the whole game and would suddenly be something that people could use. It would have enough range. It could actually power all transportation. But back to reality, it was literally in a student sort of living room lab like this when we were trying to string these things together, keep them from exploding, try and make them safe enough to run a vehicle. So it was kind of in this exact time frame, just a few years later, when almost all these other cars were using lead acid. They were failing in the market. There was nothing really going on. This was really the state of EVs in about 2002, 3, 4. And these were not desirable cars. Most of their OEMs had moved on. They'd kind of given up on them at the time because they didn't believe people wanted them, wasn't enough range, et cetera. Some of these were extremely efficient. This vehicle, the Aptera, was a very efficient design. But in some ways, the engineers and designers were such purists and so focused on efficiency that I think they may have alienated some of the market and the customers. I remember doing a test drive with them, and they were so passionate. But the windows didn't even roll down because it was a little more weight. It was too much drag. And of course, then you couldn't go to a drive-through. You couldn't do all these things that people expected and wanted to do. So a beautiful design. It was more efficient than anything that had come before. But because of the limitations of the batteries they had, there wasn't enough energy margin to have the practicality people wanted. So it was in this context, was about when I met Elon. And this was sort of the beginning of the whole Tesla journey. I met Elon in about 2003. And it was shortly after, he was much less famous than he is today. It was shortly after he had sold PayPal. So he was sort of best known for selling PayPal to eBay, and he had just started this crazy rocket company. And it was sort of the first generation of entrepreneurs starting rocket companies, so it seemed even more outlandish maybe than it does today when it's succeeding quite well. But he was really the first person, and we ended up having lunch down in Los Angeles. He was the first person that really immediately understood and resonated with what could happen and the potential for putting lithium-ion batteries in EVs. So we ended up having a long lunch discussing this and really kind of geeked out on this whole topic, and kind of conceived of the concept, the idea that we could take the best lithium-ion batteries, put thousands of them together, put that into a sports car type vehicle, and make a new vehicle and a new car company around it. And it was only a few months after this, in 2004, that he funded the Series A round for what became Tesla. I think it was about $8 million. That was the entire A round for the company, which is sort of crazy in hindsight, but that's what it was, and it felt like a vast amount of money. And we rallied around this concept, building what became the Tesla Roadster. It was really the first lithium-ion powered commercial EV, which again seems crazy. This was not that long ago. This was only 2004, less than 20 years ago. And no one had ever done this before. It was literally the first. There were tons of skeptics. It was brutally hard, actually, even though we could take the data and we could explain and show, hey, here's why it can go 250 miles, here's the performance, et cetera. People didn't believe it. There were fierce critics that said, these batteries could never work. It was impossibly unsafe. They sort of threatened that we were fraudulent and all these, crazy accusations, which was bizarre. I mean, I was an engineer, and this was data, and we were taking a model and designing a product, but it's a very emotional thing. This Roadster, became the first product for Tesla. Obviously, there was a roadmap of other vehicles, but this was really the first one that proved that lithium-ion could work in a car, and it proved that we were sort of in a different regime of, starting to not have it be a technological problem. It was more of a price issue. It was a vehicle design issue. But fundamentally now, there was enough range. There was enough energy to do something useful. So we created a roadmap of a whole bunch of other vehicles, a so-called master plan that migrated from the Roadster to what became then the Model S and the Model X, and then the Model 3 and the Model Y. And one vehicle at a time, one sort of model at a time, clawed the way all the way from being this tiny team, this ragtag bunch of people in Silicon Valley, toward building one of the largest car companies in the world. I mean, it's this incredible story. I look back on it, and it still doesn't even seem quite real sometimes. Trying to sort of realize, looking around the world and seeing these cars everywhere and people driving them. But there's a surprising amount of common heritage that goes all the way back to some decisions we made in the very beginning. Things like cylindrical cells and the use of how we made the batteries safe and maintained that kind of fire resistance and chemistry tolerance. So I think another sort of entrepreneurial lesson for me was to try and have the blessing of very lucky and good timing, but being in a market where it wasn't overly crowded, where there was enough white space to do really good design work and not be constantly kind of bounded by what the other company to your left is doing or the company to your right is doing, or concerned about IP infringement in every which way. At Tesla in the early days, it was wide open space. No one had ever tried to put lithium-ion batteries in a car before. So we had, huge latitude to design that. No one had ever put a digital AC motor control inverter in a car. So again, huge latitude to design that. And the sort of design spaces we were starting with seem kind of ridiculously broad when I think of it today. In today's world, you're kind of optimizing a much more narrow set of the problem. The example Amory showed was whether we had a 2-speed transmission or a 1-speed. And 2-speed was sort of the common wisdom. Everybody thought, okay, it's a vehicle, it must have a transmission, you must have to shift gears, and that's how you'd make the electric motor more efficient. And it was very controversial to get rid of that. We discarded the transmission entirely, went away from it, and it became all electronic speed control. And literally every EV on the road today, I can't think of any that have a gearbox, or a 2-speed gearbox, I should say. So these simple things became very transformational and kind of defined the architecture. Now, at Tesla, I had also kind of the the very lucky job, I love my role there, I got to be very entrepreneurial. And it was what I enjoyed doing the most. I sort of was a little bit restless, and I would usually jump to kind of pushing the boundary and trying to innovate some adjacent technology or business to what we were doing. So I got to do that multiple times and really enjoyed that. So one of the things I was particularly excited and proud about was pushing and innovating some of our charging networks back then. Again, it seems crazy today when you're out driving EVs around and using charging networks and supercharging, but none of that existed. Even just as little as maybe 10 to 12 years ago, none of that existed. A road trip in an EV used to constitute bringing a sleeping bag and going to an RV park or something like that and plugging in and sleeping next to your car if you could, or on a tent. It was very slow. So this was a brand new concept, doing fast DC charging. It was a brand new concept to have the company actually build that and invest in it and just sort of own the problem and say, well, the network is part of the product. So we actually started investing in it. We started building that. And this little route of dots was the very first route across the country. And we had this, again, audacious goal where we wanted to set a world record, a Guinness Book of World Records on how fast an EV could go from Los Angeles to New York. So we set out and actually had an intern go and try and find all the locations of where each one of these sites would be. We had to kind of cajole and convince these rest stops and various highway locations and coffee shops all across the country to let us put in these charging stations. But when we did it, a vehicle was able to go and sprint all the way across the country and literally set these dramatic world records that were just never possible before. And the whole thing became wildly popular. Customers, not surprisingly, just loved it. They used it seamlessly. It became this very, very simple, intuitive thing that kind of went hand in hand with launching any EVs into a market. You needed infrastructure. It needed fast charging. So I don't have any current slides on this, but there's thousands and thousands of stations now, not just from Tesla, but now from probably a dozen or more different networks and charging systems. So it's really, really cool to see how fast, it's almost like wildfire, how fast that has caught and scaled across the whole country and world. Another aspect that I was really excited to be involved in the early days was applying those same batteries we put in the car into the stationary setting. So we had, again, a sort of crazy idea that we'd have the best economics, we'd have the best availability of batteries and integrated safety systems. So why not put those into stationary settings on the grid? Use those for energy storage as well as in the cars. And that started a whole other division. It started a whole different business unit, designing things like the Powerwall and Power Pack, and then a few different derivatives that have grown from there. Now this is, I believe, well over $1 billion a quarter in revenue and growing really fast. And it's a critical way to actually make the whole grid sustainable. We can't add more solar, we can't add a whole lot more wind, especially in California, without also adding storage to begin to really buffer that and deliver it at times when we can use it. So all of this, these major different initiatives, sort of reinforced battery demand. When we could have charging, we'd sell more vehicles. When stationary storage grew, it needed more batteries. Everything needed more batteries. And when we launched the Model 3 vehicle, this was really the first mass market electric vehicle. This was about 300,000 vehicles a year when we first started it, and heading toward 500,000. It was more batteries than the entire world built at the time, more lithium-ion batteries. So there was this kind of dramatic idea to invent a whole new factory concept, a Gigafactory, that literally was bigger than the entire world output of lithium-ion batteries in one single factory. Seemed crazy, but it was simple math. If 300,000 people bought this car, somebody needed that factory. So we built it, we designed this. The first one was in northern Nevada, and it was very successful. Over a lot of years of working hard to get it to ramp, but it drove down the cost of batteries dramatically through economies of scale. Through integration, through vertical integration of cell to electrode to cell to module to pack. Also automation, a lot more software, and a lot more integration, focusing on the factory and how we built it. Some of those systems that Amory highlighted to basically save energy and save operating cost. So this was very successful. However, the part that we did not solve entirely was, one other point there. In the midst of all this chaos, when about 2017 is when I started Redwood Materials. And I didn't have a whole lot of time to focus on that at the moment. This was sort of an exciting idea that I really wanted to put some attention toward, but it was almost, in the beginning, was almost just a parking idea, a parking place. I wanted to focus on this, but could not while we were still ramping Model 3. But 2017 was right in the midst of ramping the Gigafactory and really seeing some of these challenges. And the interesting thing that the factory did was it changed the whole paradigm of how the battery cost structure worked. Previously, it was defined by the cost to assemble the battery. After the Gigafactory ramped, the raw materials, the components, determined the battery cost. And suddenly, things like all the nickel, lithium, cobalt, manganese, copper, those now were by far the majority of the cell cost. And all the gray stuff, or the bluish gray stuff, is the cost to assemble it. That's the whole Gigafactory cost. So we kind of flipped this paradigm, and suddenly the factory became the minority, and all the other stuff became the majority. And unfortunately, this has caused challenge in the battery industry, because as more Gigafactories proliferated, now there's hundreds being built or in operation around the world, the pull on the raw materials has gone so high that now those raw materials are starting to go up dramatically in price, or at least are very volatile. Some go up, down, unpredictable. And it's caused the whole battery price to start rising again for the first time ever in the last 12 months. Even though we're getting better and better at building batteries, that part of it is getting more efficient. So to me, this was a really key imperative to why Redwood and why I wanted to focus on this new company and new problem. I'm really excited to envision what the future looks like if we imagined almost a science fiction future 20, 30, 40 years in the future from now, where all of these batteries are going to be in a closed loop economy. We don't lose any of the materials in a battery. They're fundamentally different than a fossil fuel type of economy. We kind of have this intuition that when you put fossil fuels in a car, they get converted, they're gone, you never have them again. But when you put materials in a battery, they just sit there. They get used, they kind of convert around inside the battery, but at the end of life of the car, they're all still there. 98+% of them can be reused, remanufactured, and put back into a new battery. So that's a paradigm shift. And when you realize that the majority of the battery cost are in those same materials that can be reused again and again and again, it points toward a future where we can obviously start reducing the cost of the battery much further by having higher recycled material content every single year. And it seems far away. Clearly we can't recycle our way to a whole new fleet of vehicles. We need a lot of mining to get from here to there. But our focus is on how do we invent the most efficient, most direct, most capital efficient way to do that remanufacturing and recycling and link it all the way back into new production. So that also, by the way, dramatically reduces the environmental impact of those battery materials. There's perhaps 80% reduction in the emissions and the CO2 to reprocess materials from an old battery versus mining and using virgin materials. And this is all even more and more relevant because this increasing demand for batteries is not slowing down. It's almost stratospheric. It's really quite hard to even really grok the scale of this today. But looking toward the end of just this decade, we're aiming at around 2 terawatt hours of battery demand. It's just a phenomenal amount of batteries. If you remember, that first Gigafactory was only about 40 or 35 gigawatt hours, and it was the biggest ever. And now we're talking about thousands. So it's the scale of this and the impact on the world is really quite vast. Now, the other problem is this supply chain is currently strewn all over the world. It's a mess. This is what it looks like today for battery production, largely in North America. These mined materials are coming from wherever they're found geologically. They need to be transported mostly to Asia to be converted into components for those batteries, then sent all the way back, perhaps to North America, to a battery factory. So all of these transportation links take a ton of time. They have a high capital cost. They have a high risk of disruption. They're also geopolitically challenging. There's many issues with this. Again, a closed loop system has this really beautiful aspect that it can collapse all of this. Suddenly the materials are in the same market where you need them. They don't have to go very far in space or time. And if we can invent a really efficient, very fast way of reprocessing and moving them back into the supply chain, that's the future that we're all heading toward. Now at Redwood, we sort of have 3 major business units. I won't spend too much time on this, but it's almost like three companies sort of integrated with each other. We have a recycling business that goes and collects batteries from consumers wherever we can find them. We have a refining business in the middle that separates all the valuable metals apart, purifies them, really makes them back into usable materials. And then on the other side, we remanufacture. We make components, sort of valuable subcomponents that can be used again in a battery. And the timeline for the company has been dramatic. I never expected, actually, that this would be quite such a center of attention. I thought we'd sort of be working on recycling architecture for maybe a half a decade quietly before anyone really noticed. But quite the opposite. The whole world, I think, has woken up to the supply constraints and the critical metals constraints. So we've been growing very quickly. I, again, won't go through every one of these milestones, but we're focused on a Series D of funding right now. We have maybe around 700 or 800 people. We have multiple campuses that we're building kind of simultaneously, and also are now in a position where there's enormous political will and support for this in the US like there never was before. So we've been lucky to have strong support from the Department of Energy. We were the recipient of at least a conditional commitment for a large loan from the Department of Energy to help ramp these facilities and to help make some of those investments. So it's been an exciting history, and I love being an entrepreneur. For me, that's part of the fun. Many people asked, why on earth would I possibly leave this CTO role at Tesla? It was this wonderful job. People would fight for this role. And it was fabulous. But I love being an entrepreneur. And as Tesla was scaling and growing and becoming hugely successful, it was exactly what we always hoped it could do. Being an entrepreneur was harder and harder, and it was different. And you can't really simulate that inside of a big company. Try as big companies might, you cannot simulate it. It's not the same. There's not that real fear of death. You can always sort of go back to, okay, if this new thing fails, I'll just go back and work on the other thing. In a startup, it's different. It's clarity of focus. It's really quite pure. So this is a short flow sheet. We basically recycle all these different feedstocks, all the way from old consumer batteries, old EV batteries. We mix those with some new materials. There are some mined materials, and make things like cathode material and copper foils. A lot of components most people don't think about, but they make up a lot of the cost structure of a battery that goes inside your electric vehicle. I'll skip over some of this because I don't want us to be too short on time here, but maybe one point on collection of these batteries. It's actually quite a grassroots activity. There's no regulation in the US right now that even requires people to recycle batteries. It's perfectly legal, and most batteries actually get thrown in the garbage. People just literally chuck it in the garbage. It goes in the landfill. So we're out working quite hard and trying to almost do advocacy around recycling on the front end of the company. Increasing recycling rates, making this easier for people, adding some technology to this around sorting and collection so that it's even lower cost to scale this. But it's really, really crazy to me that we would go through all this work to do exploration, a permit a mine, dig up the earth, refine the materials, make it into a product, and then throw it away. It's just kind of crazy when you zoom out from it. So being able to keep every one of those precious bits of material that we went through all the trouble to make and mine the first time seems like just such a natural thing we have to do. And to give you a sense of scale, also a lot of people sort of think, oh, how could there possibly be enough batteries to make this relevant yet? This is a view of one of our, actually our main processing facility in Nevada. These are pallets. Each one of those is maybe 1,000 pounds. It's like twice the size of this podium, full of batteries. So this is just a small snapshot of the batteries coming back in the world. And I kind of challenge you to look at your life. Think around you and think how many things in your nearby life have a lithium-ion battery in them. It's quite shocking. You probably have 2 or 3 of them on your person at the moment, and then you go home and there's you're surrounded in them. There might be one in your car. It's incredible. And every one of those, of course, has to come back at some point. It's another opportunity to recover it and harvest it. So as we look forward, our focus is on production, on scaling our whole operation. We're aiming at enough production for about 1 million vehicles per year of cathode and anode copper foils. This is sort of our trajectory that we're heading toward. It's a lot of capital. It's a lot of growth and development. But this is a meaningful scale, and it's something that can actually move the needle on the overall cost and emissions for these raw materials in the country and in the world. And I believe the same systems we're building and architecting, kind of just like supercharging and just like early roadster battery architecture, they feel broadly relevant to me. Even though this is sort of the very beginning of having enough traction to start to build a closed-loop ecosystem for batteries, I think if we were sitting here in 20 or 30 years, it's going to be patently obvious that most of the materials in batteries will be recycled. Most of them will be in a closed loop. And once the whole fleet is in a steady state, that loop that's going around the remanufacturing will be much larger than all the lithium and nickel and copper mining that services it today. It's just math. So it was shocking to me that more companies weren't working on this. So this is a quick little snapshot of kind of our progress to date. We'll let this run, but it gives you a more visual indication of what we've been up to and what we're doing. Thank you all.